in your long education history, it's come up at different times for me. It's come up for me,
Right. Right.
but
But like in passing, right? Like, oh yeah, there's quick reference and then moving on, but not a deep dive. And particularly because
yeah.
it plays such a instrumental role in America, and the influence and really the world. So yeah.
Is it similar for you, or is this something that you have studied that was already part of your world fund of information?
Oh well, this was deeply discussed in the Thamusasa. Matter of fact, we frequently hear about one pivotal figure, but there were several pivotal figures in the Haitian Revolution. Some black women who were really important figures in that revolution. So yeah, we would discuss that a lot. But I would say like it's not one of the things that you hear about, and I think revolutions period is the conversation, particularly from enslaved people, particularly black people in this hemisphere, that was really downplayed a lot for reasons, right? Like I think there's reasons they did not want this talked about. You
Mm,
just started hearing more people talking about Nat Turner,
mm.
right? But when you talk about like Denmark Vesey and Gabrielle Prosser and the Stono Rebellion, like all of these, they're not front and center in a lot of, the dialogue about American history, and it should be.
Leave it to you to have, already have learned about this at your
Leave it
famed
to
school
those teachers,
in,
man. They
in your young years. Good for
you talk
you.
about problem child. I think they wanted a bunch of problem children, right? Like, and that's how they approached it. So yeah,
Well,
I'm
listen,
gonna have to get one of your hats.
we have an official historian who will be able to join us today, who's with us, who's been with me before on the show. Dr. William Horne is a teacher, writer, speaker, editor, historian, and an avid tweeter or Twitterer. He tweets often about the history of Black liberation and other race-related histories. I like to follow him. Two reasons. One, his internet feed makes you smarter. So I love when you follow people or you follow their feed. And if you do it on the daily, you get tidbits and dates and histories to things that fill in gaps in your knowledge. So that's what Dr. Horne does online. If you want to find him, people listening and watching and following along with us today, you can just search for him, William Horne, on Twitter, and you'll find him. And at the end of the show, we'll give you his actual Twitter address, but we're going to bring him in right now. Dr. Horne, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you all so much for having me.
We are happy to have you today because anybody who can make us smarter about portions of history that may have been forgotten or not fully taught to us, that's a good use of our time and our platform always. And on this particular one, let's just start by me asking this question. There have been hundreds of uprisings, revolutions, revolts that go undocumented when it comes to African Americans in American history, but not just in American history, in global history, like in all places. There have been these revolts. When we talk about the Haitian Revolution, what's the importance of it in the context of there being so many other revolutions and revolts and uprisings or whatever? Help us situate this one with context.
Yeah, that's such a great question because most of my research is in the U.S. and it's very U.S. focused. And my interest in the Haitian Revolution is in part, having grown up in New Orleans and realizing that there is this whole Haitian diaspora in the early 19th century, early 1800s, and even, continuing into the 20th century that's connected to New Orleans. But then also learning about, really in graduate school, learning about how the Haitian Revolution inspired other Black revolutions, Black revolts, particularly among enslaved people. This is something that was very interesting to me that I think is a crucial piece of our history that is, not taught in that way, and for a very specific set of reasons, I think. And so my interest in the revolution is very much informed by those sets of circumstances.
And Sharif, how would you answer that same question? Like, what's the importance out of all of the other studies that we might do on revolts, uprisings, and points in time in history? How do you see this?
Yeah, I see I agree with Dr. Horne. Not only the global influence, particularly Black people, and you can see why they didn't want Black folks to be able to read, right? Reading about what Toussaint and others were doing could be really compelling. But I think the other piece is it's a rebellion against government, right? Like the entire government, entire structure, where a lot of some of the other rebellions were against, the enslaved, the local, this was more of an international impact when you think about, colonizers and France and their, you're talking about a superpower. And talking about like David versus Goliath, this is literally what this looks like. But I also think it shows and demonstrates, you know when you talk about like the Maroons in Jamaica, or you're talking about, very similarly in Haiti, where these people were banding together, moving out and creating these small groups. But then how does it manifest? And so for me, like the ripple effect of people freeing themselves, freeing their families, then communities, then you have an army, So it's just like constant, movement and depth to the story that I think a lot of times just isn't, it's not dug into it. So I'm so glad that we're doing this. And, it's been quite some time for me to even think about it. To it's like, oh yeah, this is it's so many entrails, I think, to this story, and the complexities, and then and it's inspiring and tragic all at the same time.
Yeah, so Dr. Horne, well, inspiring and tragic. It's like,
yeah,
they fought and they achieved their goal, but it was not something that was easily won, and that you would. It's not for the faint of heart. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and be a revolutionary and go and achieve the same thing. Dr. Horne, I would ask you a question just about to help us, situate in context the actors and the players. I know that the Spanish had a hand. There are indigenous people there. There are people who have been involuntarily imported there. There's the French. The United States has some sort of touch on this or whatnot. Can you just help us with the actors and the players, the who's who within the story?
Yeah, that's such an important point. So I guess to dovetail, to piggyback off of what Sharif was sharing, yeah, the Haitian revolutionaries had been enslaved people. They've been, working, under forced labor conditions, right? This is what slavery is, for forced labor conditions in Haiti for generations. Many of them, had actually they survived the Middle Passage, right? And so many of these people were in fact not even born in Haiti, but were born in Africa. And so there's a very diverse, multilingual community that animates this revolution and that launches it and succeeds. And they defeat the French. They also defeat the British and the Spanish, the three sort of superpowers in the world today. So I guess imagine, I don't know if there's a sort of a revolution of oppressed people today that defeated, I don't know, like the U.S., that defeated China, and I don't know, some other I guess Russia, or some other superpower, right? Like this would be sort of an analogous situation, right? And so what they accomplished is incredible. And the way in which they went about it, is also incredible. And I think there's a lot that we can glean today, that we can get from learning about how this revolution unfolded, how it was organized, the particular tactics and targets that the revolutionaries used.
And when we think about the Constitution that came out of this uprising, this revolt, this revolution, however you want to frame it, what is important about the document, the original document, that we could learn from today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing, if we're looking at it from a Haitian perspective and from the perspective of the revolutionaries, is that they abolished slavery unequivocally. A lot of the fighting between France and Haiti was actually because the French, after the French Revolution had succeeded, essentially tried to re-enslave the Haitian revolutionaries. They were having none of it, right? And so this is really, the first, successful revolt of enslaved people in the, what we call the Western Hemisphere, or like the Americas, right? So Haiti is in the Caribbean, but this creates a country of formerly enslaved people who achieved their freedom for themselves, not that far off the shores of the U.S. And so, from an American, from a U.S. perspective, I think that informs maybe why people at the time, those in power at the time, covered up the successes of the Haitian Revolution, and also why perhaps we don't learn about it in a way that we should in our schools today.
I think you may have hit your mic too. You cut out just for a second there. So you have an enslaved population that has an uprising and that turns into a revolution. They overthrow their oppressors. This is 1804 that they form a Declaration of Independence. And in doing so, they create a new country of formerly enslaved people who are now free, who in 1804 are outlawing slavery right in the United States backyard, who would go on in the United States would go on for another, 50 something years of having enslaved people or whatnot. I love how we often talk about, this is a conservative stance oftentimes. United States, outlawed slavery for the first time in the world before anybody else or whatever, or was one of the first, and blah, 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 that's the talking point. And Haiti did it in 1804. And it wasn't because some people sat around and said, hey, maybe we should be good people. And, some colonial power said, no, it was because that torch was coming for you. And some folks burned it down. Sharif, what do you think about the way that I started today? To me, this is a pretty profound thing that I just said. Formerly enslaved people in a nation who, long before anybody else in colonial powers, declared their own freedom and outlawed slavery. And there's some pretty interesting. I'll come back to you, Dr. Horne, talk about some of the text in there that you find really resonant, like within their declaration. But where I started with this was to say that this was one of those stories that escaped my education in my years of being educated in the United States. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things, man. It's just so fascinating. Again, when you think about self-determination, this is a key part of it. And when I think about the self-determination on one side of the coin, in this really dramatic piece of history, but also think about the hypocrisy, right? You had the French Revolution, and everything from was let them eat cake. That was from that country, right? Like that whole phrase from the Queen or whatever, right? So like you have them saying like, nah, we're gonna remove this yoke, right? And I think it's an important part, because a lot of times, people are constantly thinking that, oh, in Europe it was, they were already thinking about democracy. They had some pretty oppressive systems, for their own people, let alone people who they viewed as subhuman, right? And so they really took those structures and then created a whole new system in the Western hemisphere. But it had a history to how they treated their own people, people who were poor, people who didn't own land, people who were not educated. And so to see that, and then you also have an African way of life, right? When you talk about even the idea, like there were women who led some of the battles, right? In the Haitian Revolution, right? So you're taking this African way of life, like, no, these are, so this whole idea of feminism, but then looking at it from an African perspective. I think so often people look at progress or ending enslavement or writing constitutions as, oh, this is European, or this is white American, right? It's the same thing we talk about, like the classic. Oh, the classic has to be, classic music is only one section. Like, no, we all got our classics, bruh. And no, we all have different ways of how we looked at our women, how we looked at our children, how we looked at education, how we looked at freedom. And so I think what Chairman Fred always talks about, like, elevate the inconsistencies. There are a lot of inconsistencies about how people talk about history, who started what, who initially created what, and the actuality.
So when we think about the Declaration of their Declaration of Independence, I'd love to know more about what they're modeling it on, where they're getting their inspiration from. How are they constructing this? Is it whole cloth, or are they pulling from, examples elsewhere? Just if you could, Dr. Horne, kind of tell us a little bit more about this as their foundational document.
Right. Yeah. So, my understanding of the genre, like of declarations, is that like this is very new at the time that they're writing. We have, essentially, the Declaration of Independence for the U.S. that we're familiar with, parts of it, and we have the, a declaration in the French Revolution, and this in some ways plays off of that, but I think points to, these inconsistencies, right? In the way that we talk about independence, in the way that we talk about self-determination, right? And so, one of the things that I love about this document, it's one of the documents that I teach in some of my courses, is that they make the, Dessalines, the author, makes clear that the French, in fact, initiate a system of violence. And so what enslaved people in Haiti were revolting against, and what they were trying to accomplish, was overturning that existing system of violence. This is a really important point to me, and I think for us more broadly, because we tend to think of like revolutions as being like introducing violence in some way. I think that's totally wrong. Like that's backwards, actually. The whole point of revolutions is to end a system of violence. I mean, this is something that we see expressed quite explicitly in the Haitian Declaration of Independence.
That's pretty interesting. Like,
yeah.
I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, even how it starts off, right? It's like juxtaposing, how they would look at African people like barbarians and savage, right? When they're like, no, we're actually freedom-loving people, right, and we expelled the barbarians. Like even that first sentence I think is so important because it counters exactly what Dr. Horne is saying. This is to fix something. This is to reverse something. It's not enough to have expelled the barbarians. That's how they were described, right?
Right.
But they're saying no. It's the exact opposite. They bloodied the land for 200 years plus.
Right.
And I think it's very similar, even today. And that's why who tells the stories is so important. These primary documents are so important. Even just sticking with the French for a little bit and going further up north, people hear scalping and they think like, oh, that's a Native American tradition. That's what they would do. Like, no, the French introduced scalping to America. The French were scalping people. But because they wrote the story later, it was like, oh, yeah, Native American, the savages, they were scalping people. Like, no. They returned that favor to you, but that they didn't. You introduced that to them, Right. So I think history is so important, but also who's telling his story is absolutely critical.
I think it's interesting that in the first paragraph, we must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhuman government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating torpor. In the end, we must live independent or die. The last couple of days, I've been engaged in these dinners that have been kind of Lincoln type dinners. We started out calling them Jeffersonian dinners, but that was problematic. So we are now calling them Lincoln dinners. And as part of the opening to the dinner, our very able moderator reads the 2-minute Gettysburg address from Lincoln. It's very short, but it's everything that could be said about Gettysburg. And I'm only bringing it up because if you think about the prose, or you think about the language in that, the highfalutin language, and then you read what I just read from the Haitian Revolution that came many, many, many years before Lincoln did the Gettysburg Address, you could confuse what the Haitians were saying about their own independence and about what must happen after the revolution. You could just easily tell somebody that was happening in America, and that was Lincoln saying that years later. But here it is happening in a very Black, formerly enslaved place where they are using the prose and the language to exert this kind of major premise of freedom, this major premise of we will either be independent or we'll die, which is a pretty strong, because I don't know that I want that choice anyways. We could read these histories, by the way, just, we could read these histories as kind of like, oh yeah, I know what I would have done. Yeah, I don't know about that, to be very honest with you. I mean, we could live independent, or maybe die strong. Die is like, that's a strong outcome, but they were ready for it.
That's what Malcolm said. He said, don't let the word revolution come out of your mouth unless you're ready to die for it,
Right.
Yeah. Don't even, just stop using the word,
Some of us would probably just say, die is extreme, but I'll complain. I'm either going to live in
freedom or complaints.
Yeah, freedom or hear me complain.
It does illustrate, though, just how dire that situation was, right? Because, for them, I think it really was a life or death circumstance, right? Mm-hmm. Succeed in this revolution, or like exist under this system of like mass torture, dehumanization, and murder, I mean, dire. Yeah.
Your point is really well taken, though, on the revolutions aren't necessarily what we think. We rebrand them as being violent acts, but usually they're meant to stop violence and violent acts. What were some of the conditions that were pushing Haitians to this point? The point where they had to fight or die.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to point people to a different text, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. It was written in the 1930s. I think you can access it for free if you Google it. And James goes into great detail in this. There's a much shorter version in his History of Pan-African Revolt that also touches on some of the enslaver violence. But we're talking about really, really gruesome stuff. There are accounts of people being baked alive in ovens. I mean, just absolutely horrible tortures for enslaved people that enslavers, wielded both as a sort of a weapon, but also as a form of like, what we would call like spectacle violence, making an example out of somebody to make sure that everyone else, is compliant, right? And so this is a really brutal system. And as you can imagine, slavery, more broadly, is a really brutal system. That was true in the U.S. That was true in Cuba and Brazil, right? Just all across places where we had systems of chattel slavery. You find versions of this really just despicable, horrific torture and violence, because that's sort of what is necessary in order to deprive people of their freedom, right? People don't just accept enslavement, right? And so, although we tend not to see accounts of this kind of violence in archival spaces as much, like that's much more because those were controlled by the people who were doing the writing, right? Like we already talked about, like how enslaved people were literally banned from learning to read and write, and so what we have is a very limited window into what we can perceive, just based on like all of the evidence that we have. Like these types of systems were extremely violent. And the Haitian, slavery, it was no exception.
So on the day that, Haitians commit themselves to their freedom and to the violence of a revolution, it's nothing to match the violence that they have been living through prior to that. Right. I wonder if a big part of this story is that we do too little also to educate ourselves and our children or young people, not just on these type of histories, but also like on France, for instance. This isn't the only place where France had, like, I think we're very ignorant about France. I think in a lot of ways we think of France as like one of the good guys oftentimes. They're so much more liberated in some ways. We talk about like, like Jefferson going to France, and they're already kind of liberated and they've gotten rid of like, slavery, and Sally Hemings could be free if she stayed there in France or whatnot. We have stories of like James Baldwin and others going to France to find refuge from American racism. At the same time, though, that France is still practicing a level of brutal colonial empire-like behavior all over the world.
Right. It's crazy, right? I mean, and to add to that, right, like oh, they helped us fight the British, right? So like that's in the American Revolution,
Yeah.
right? And
I
so
mean,
that's
what's a little empire among friends? What's a
yeah,
little colonial
exactly,
behavior among
exactly.
friends? Is this story analogous to? Well, no. Let me back up. Let me just ask this: is this story with the Haitian kind of achieving their independence the only one that we have like this, or would we consider some of the African kind of independence movement of the 1950s and 60s and others to be similar in like overthrowing colonial governments? I mean, what is particular about the Haitian Revolution versus some of those other independence marches?
Yeah, I think the biggest particularity, right, the one thing that sort of sets it apart, is the experience, the historical experience of chattel slavery, the Middle Passage, right? The enslaved people who launched this revolution in Haiti didn't get there by accident or by choice, right?
Mm,
And that's, I guess, less true of like other anti-colonial struggles. Depending upon the empire, of course, depending upon the place, but like we might compare, let's say, the Algerian, revolution, against France, in the mid 20th century, to what the Haitian revolutionaries, were seeking. It's very similar goals,
mm,
self-determination, equality, those sorts of things, right? Um, and yet, in the Algerian case, these are people who were not like transported, thousands of miles from their homes,
mm,
right?
mhm.
And so there is, I think, an important distinction to be made. But I think you're, right, if I'm understanding kind of like the basic idea of the question, which is that like these are similar struggles, to anti-colonial and
Mhm.
decolonial struggles, that we might think of from the 20th or 21st century, right? These are things that are ongoing.
Yeah, so what we know about France is that like once you throw off their yoke of, kind of colonial authority, they generally have been pretty good at saying, "Hey guys, my bad. Let me give you some money for the trouble that we caused you. We're going to be very supportive of you from now on." So that's probably what happened in Haiti, right? I mean, like after this all went down, so France probably said, "Hey, Haiti, we're sorry that we did that. Here's some money and stuff." Like that's what happened, right?
Reparations.
Yeah, we give you some reparations.
I mean, yeah,
All bets are off.
that's what should happen, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what should have happened. And of course, as you know, right, this is a leading question. I object. But the opposite happened, right? And so France refused to recognize Haitian independence along with all of the other world powers, and in fact forced them to pay an indemnity of billions of dollars in today's currency, for winning their own freedom. I think of it today as like sort of like fighting to be free, but then also purchasing yourself, like after
Mhm,
you already
mhm.
fought and many of your friends, neighbors, relatives died, in that struggle. It's absurd, and yet this is, in many ways, I think, like how colonial struggles have worked since then. It is in fact the colonized people who paid the biggest price for their own independence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Sharif, I'll like ask you about this. Like, there's a way that today people could look at Haiti and have all the wrong kind of misinformed ideas about why there usually is so much turmoil in Haiti now. Like,
Hmm.
and this seems to have been the pattern with colonial folks when they leave a country. Then it becomes, well, see, you guys can't govern yourselves,
Oh yeah.
without us. Like you can't govern us without us.
That's part of the playbook, man. Excuse me. That's definitely part of the playbook. Fostering internal strife as I'm leaving. Like it's literally like dropping a bomb that doesn't go off maybe like right away. It goes off in sequence. It's one of those cluster bombs, right? And that's generally what colonial powers leave behind.
Hmm.
Because it's like, okay, not only are we leaving, we're going to take the wealth out. However we can continue to do that. We're going to try to install a puppet. If we can't do that, we're just going to create mayhem.
Hmm.
We're going to foster. We see it time and time. France involvement in Vietnam, France involvement in Indochina. There was a French president, and I forget what he said. He's like, without the wealth that we're taking from that we continue to take from the colonial powers, we wouldn't have an economy. So it props up, the colonial powers in such a way for longevity. That's their sustainability plan.
Mm-hmm.
Is to continue to find, how do I leech from resources from other parts of the world to continue to, fund our, our supremacy that we still believe in. Even if we left your country, we still believe in our supremacy, and we're going to figure out how to engineer that in different ways. Continue, and particularly creating mayhem, so you also have self-doubt whether you can self-govern. That, like, what a strategy, to continue to leave that behind even after you've physically left.
Yeah, one of the lessons that I did have, I didn't really have this lesson about the Haitian Revolution, but I do remember a lesson in high school about France, how they, one of the African nations that they had formerly colonized, one of the parts of their exit to help that nation was they made them transfer all their crops to peanuts, and so that they could supply France with peanuts and peanut butter. And that was the country's like sole agricultural product at that point, excluding all other agricultural products, which eventually put them into hunger because they couldn't feed themselves, because they were being treated as just as a country, one big field for the peanut economy for France. And I remember that, like, seeing me as a young person, having that lesson and seeing how that seems so absurd that nobody else would object, like no other countries in the world, no other people in the world. And still today, when I hear Dr. Horne say Haiti was made to pay almost a ransom for its freedom to its actual oppressors for a long period of time, it's just amazing to me that there hasn't been a movement in this late date, as of this point, to set things right, as we still see there being, the aftermath and the turmoil in Haiti. That's, a lot of it is economic in its basis, right? And no one has ever pushed. We need a second wave of the anti-colonial kind of comeuppance. I don't know how else to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we need another wave of that.
Accountability, yeah. Because people think it ended, and this ended, and no, it could. Wait a minute, a couple of months ago, New York Times ran a story. I didn't even read it. About the Haitian Revolution, the aftermath, and France's reverse reparations, which is similar to America, right? Like, the government gave reparations to the slave enslavers. Right. Said, oh, forget this Reconstruction deal. Like, y'all the ones that were, y'all are the aggrieved. We took your property away, because that means I still literally look at you as property, even though, but so I didn't even read this New York Times article, but Twitter was blowing up about the amount of people who had never heard of it. I was just like, this is like, this got to be one of the most ignorant countries. Like, I was just like, how Ray always like, I hate it here. I was just like, I hate it here. Like, I didn't read the article, but I just kept seeing, like, I never heard of that. I never heard of it. Oh, how come we didn't know this? Because you went to public schools, dummy. Like, that's why you haven't heard of it. You went to these schools. They ain't teaching you that.
Yeah, and we talk in fancy terms around like colonialism, and we need to decolonize things or whatnot. This is the literal business of white supremacy. Yeah. This is global white supremacy. This is how it is stacked, and this is how the economy of it works. This is how it is decided who wins and who loses and who gets what. And you just said it a minute ago. This is how France survives, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. The entire French business model for their existence is a economic white supremacy business model, because you notice, and Dr. Horne, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I can't think of a single white nation that is under any of these type of agreements with another nation, like is subject to, like, I can't imagine the Dutch being under the thumb of Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. like right. This is a one direction type of arrangement in the world.
Right. Yeah. And, it's interesting. We tend to talk about, I don't know, Western Europe as being a very equitable place, as having great, vibrant democracies and all of those things. One of the things that interests me about this way of looking at the world is that we forget about the capital that funds all of that, right? One of the articles that I teach in one of my graduate courses looks at European welfare states as essentially like products of colonization, which pans out like when you sort of dig into the numbers. We tend to think of these places as having really great social safety nets. Those are really funded by colonial plunder, both like historical, but also like in many respects ongoing. This is how capitalism works. And so you're exactly right. Like we don't see quote unquote white countries like under this sort of system, and in fact exactly the opposite. The sort of things that we associate with developed countries are in fact simply like the byproducts of plunder.
That's a very, like, you're going to make some enemies on that one. Just as of last night or yesterday, I was talking about how American democracy is very much in a fragile position and where we have an existential threat. I feel like a crazy person sometimes talking about it because I don't think other people are as alarmed as I am. I really believe we have an existential threat. Like, the idea that what we take for granted as the democratic process is in real trouble here. And I pointed to some of these European nations that you were talking about where I said they're getting it more right than we are, right? Like they have a better social safety net and welfare net and a general sense that everybody within their society has a base level of prosperity, right? Like, so you're probably not going to get robbed in some of those places because of a hunger crime. Like, they're not going to have as many survival crimes, like, and they're going to have a safer society. So then I come to this conversation today and you just completely blow that up, Dr. Horne. So I just, thanks. Appreciate that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you see it now. You see, like right now, people are like, "Hey, you know what? We stole this artifact. You know what? We stole tens of thousands of artifacts, but we're going to return these 10." And then they want to be applauded for it. Like, to me, that's like the audacity of it all. Like, oh, hey, Ghana, we're going to return this. This was, the important piece of the Akan tradition, and so we're going to just like, yo, that whole British museum it should be empty. It should be pretty much empty. It's all about. This is the colonial conquering that we've done, but now we're making it like, oh, this is an educational and research facility. Like, I mean, it's the way that stuff is spun is absolutely ridiculous. But we're like, oh yeah, this is like this is normal. It's not normal. This is absolutely insanity, and it just continues. It is the blueprint for continued domination and theft of resources from around the world.
So the importance of this lesson to me around Haiti's amazing kind of struggle for freedom, they're achieving it through revolution and getting it, but them at the gun, at the bayonets, the warships of France having to do kind of like a ransom note, having to, fund their own ransom, billions of dollars, billions and billions and billions of dollars. And nothing makes a country successful like billions and billions of dollars. So if we talk about where Haiti is, maybe one of the important reasons for not teaching this very much is because it leads to activism. Like right now, there should be some activism around making France repay all that it took from Haiti. Like if we're talking about reverse reparation, we should talk about reversing the reverse reparations as a act of modern justice, right? Like France shouldn't just be, I mean, France is like, president is running around like Playboy guy, all telegenic and all like, I'm the good guy. I'm the Bill Clinton of France. And, aren't we cool? Blah, 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 blah. And somebody needs to say, no. See, you don't get to have that PR campaign without having to stop and face the music, because the music comes eventually. You eventually will face this, right? Whether it's in our time or right now or 10 years from now or 30 years from now, I literally believe these bills always come due, right? So they're living right now, in my mind, on borrowed time. And I think one of the reasons for teaching these type of lessons is to give people the forensics of what went down so that they can use it for activism to correct history.
Yeah.
Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think that's why we're seeing this, vibrant whitewashing, book banning campaign today in the US, the quote unquote anti-CRT campaign. I mean, it's very much mobilized around this idea that if you teach what actually happened, and some of the documents actually even spell this out, if you teach what actually happened, then people are going to hate America, right? And that sounds absurd. It is absurd, and yet, like, it is very eye-opening to learn, for instance, that, the US, not only like acquiesced, but actually like participated in this plunder of Haiti. During the Wilson administration, the US actually occupies Haiti and occupies it for like 20 years to take like all of this revenue for itself and for its European partners, right? Like this is a plunder that we participated in. It wasn't even like our colony, right? And so I think that this is like important information for us as we try to make sense of the world as it exists today, but also as we work to create a world that is like actually livable, actually survivable, one that is actually equitable. And we're definitely not there yet. But I agree, like this creates a super unstable situation. One that, the comeuppance says eventually it's going to come, right? Like it's inevitable, because you can't maintain these systems of oppression like indefinitely, in perpetuity. It creates instability. This is what led to the revolution, right? It was the enslavement. It was the oppression that led enslaved people to revolt. Revolting is like very time consuming, very dangerous. You don't do it just for funsies, right? Like, it was the system of oppression that led to this. And until we like actually address that for ourselves in the present, we're going to continue to see this sort of instability play out.
What was, you just kind of mentioned it, we didn't talk about it yet. What was the United States' role in all this, and what has been their role since?
Yeah, so the historic role of the U.S. has been to support, this reverse reparations process. So the U.S. also refused to recognize Haitian independence. Lincoln, actually, we mentioned Lincoln earlier. Lincoln sort of somewhat participates in this before we eventually do recognize Haitian independence, because he wants to deport the formerly enslaved people in the U.S. during the Civil War, and so this is a process that is actually like ongoing in his administration, like as he is, working on the Emancipation Proclamation. And so this sort of what we might think of as like like what we hear sometimes in schools as like a gift of freedom from the Lincoln administration. It is like anything but that, right? This is a response to the demands of enslaved people in the U.S. They demanded to serve in the military. They demanded liberation. They demanded the right to vote. Those demands are eventually met, but only because of their organizing, only because of their activism. So Lincoln is actually like super problematic himself, I guess. But that's maybe another story for another day. But yeah, the U.S. participates in this colonial process, and they do it all around the Caribbean. Throughout, Central and South America. And, unfortunately, this process continues into the late 20th and early 20th century in the US, unfortunately. We might call them, let's say, like development dollars or things like that. We might talk about like, I don't know, like resisting regimes or but really what we're talking about is, in fact, simply depriving people of self-determination. And doing that to exploit their resources and their labor. This is a very old system that is, in many respects, ongoing.
That just all to me sounded like you're trying to get people to hate America, though.
I mean, I don't know. I would just like people to know what happened. They can come to their own conclusions themselves.
Yeah, it still feels like it's totally like hate America and you hate white people. I don't know, I think that leads me to a question, and Sharif, I don't know what you think about this too, but like you inform yourself, you learn the story, you commit yourself to justice and activism, and then you ask very practical questions like, what should the United States policy toward Haiti right now be? What should we as citizens be fighting our own government to do in terms of taking a position on Haiti? Because it seems to me, if you look at Haiti and you look at the Dominican Republic next door to each other, you see a tale of two very different places on one island, right? Like, and that all comes down to the way that global powers, including ours, the United States, has treated those two places. So is it enough to show up when there's an earthquake and bring in a whole bunch of bottled water? Is that kind of like our policy? Should that be the United States policy? Or should we actually be pushing our government towards a justice orientation in our policy, which might make them think about what we owe Haiti, and then also think about what France owes Haiti?
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is all connected, Chris. I mean, the whole idea of America's refusal to involve itself in any type of reconciliation within the shores, outside of the shores, like they've been staunchly adamant to not do that. You see little towns or cities saying like, "Hey, we're going to apologize." You saw last year or the past couple of years, maybe a couple towns saying, "Hey, we're going to implement this type of reparation." You know, just something like an acknowledgement. You know, America refuses to do even that, right? Like, and so what does it mean when a country has raped and pillaged and murdered for hundreds of years, and yet the government, who claims it is, you know, outsourcing democracy, can't even acknowledge that within its own history? Like, just shows the depths of depravity that it has and what this system is actually structured and built on. So I don't see them acknowledging any of their, you know, because they don't. America, if you think about it, they don't even describe themselves as a colonial power, even though that's exactly what they were doing over here as well. As they were fighting the British, they were also like, "Yo, down here, down south of us, like, yo, we should have these islands. We should be taking this over. Like, all right, France, y'all are old world colonial. Let us hold my beer. Let us show you the new way of, you know, what colonial powers."
Who are you saying
look
that
like.
about? The United States?
America was saying that to
Man,
Europe.
I'm not
You
going
know
to
what I
have
mean?
any of this anti-Americanism this morning.
You
I
know,
don't know
like
what you're doing.
so I think part of it is just us being aware, teaching it, and making sure it doesn't stay buried. And also just constantly, you know, pointing out the hypocrisy of it all. You know, so as soon as they start, "Oh, this is the, or that country, this is the," like we say, like, no, whatever you say about Iran, you actually did supported a coup d'etat. The CIA destabilized them,
Right.
and everything that happened after that was because of that, your involvement, right? And we could just keep pointing, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Iran, whether it's other parts of Asia, whether it's all up and down. I mean, I had a book when I was a kid. My aunt had it, and every time I would go there, I would read it, and it was just about the CIA involvement in Central America. The book was like this thick, just about their involvement
Yeah.
and just their sickness, right? Because all the stuff they talk about, like the other, they're doing it, right? In these secret, you know, we talk about secret jails now. No, that's been going on, you know, and their involvement in some of the sickest stuff is just a continuation. And so now I think, one, just making sure that we're vigilant and we're aware, and we don't we don't believe the hype, as PE used to say, right? Because it's very easy to fall into, yeah, we're resistant, but oh my gosh, this is amazing country, and everywhere else is still worse. Like no. Why might you perceive it worse? Who told you that? And what are they struggling against to try to maintain dignity, humanity, sanity, and just a level of you know, just organization in the country? America's job is to destabilize, but also destabilize our thinking. And that's the danger of it. Our thinking is destabilized in so many different ways because we're bombarded with so many lies and half truths and falsehoods. And if you're not vigilant about that, you will start believing it. It's like it's been billions of dollars of like how to brainwash you, but we all think like that doesn't happen here. That happens everywhere else. No, it happens right here, particularly right here.
You know, you've heard me say this, I think, once before. First of all, I am on TikTok, everybody listening and watching. As an old person, I am an old person on TikTok. I'm kind of a big deal there.
They're going to kick you out.
But so often you will hear me say stuff like, "I learned this on TikTok." This one TikTok came up. Well, there was a TikTok of somebody, and I think it was an American high schooler who went to Germany and did a TikTok on Germans teaching of American history, how different it is than our own version of it, and how de-indoctrinating it is. I don't know if there's a word there, but so I went out and bought the book, right? And it's slim, it's elegant, it's thin, it's not a lot of information, but it does talk about the delusion of America. Like America is literally being taught delusional things about itself, about its exceptionalism and these different things. And it's just funny to see a different country who doesn't have any investment in us becoming dumb citizens, like how they teach their citizens about what we're being taught about ourselves, right? And you just mentioned, what you just said is firmly in that book. When you get it, it's a very kind of clean, just like, no, it's literally known that Americans indoctrinate themselves. Like they literally lie to themselves about their position in the world or whatnot. And this isn't like Germany trying to be mean. Germany loves America. America loves Germany. Blah, blah, blah. We're all friends and stuff like that. No, they're not. They're just teaching their people not to be as ignorant as us about us, right? Like they're teaching our history in a way we should be teaching ourselves. Like this is the way the indoctrination machine works. I think, though, and someone has already said this as a quote, that education is for action. And the reason that you would stop education is because you don't want certain actions to take place. So very educated population on stories like the Haitian, the lineage of the revolution, like what happened afterwards and how do we get to today, might cause people to become more kind of demanding that their government make right in the world things that we now know are wrong. But if you don't know it, then there's not going to be any action around these things, which is a good reason to pass memory laws. It's a good reason to outlaw books and to outlaw knowledge and to start subtracting books from the libraries rather than adding books to the library, right? Like when they start going after libraries and schools and what teachers can say and what they can practice, and even outlawing, we want to outlaw feeling uncomfortable about your country. We don't want that to even be a thing. Like you can't even feel uncomfortable. Man, listen, if you guys are not as alarmed as I am about the moron movement, like this is a movement to make 1 million morons in the United States. And I think that that's why we use this platform for these type of topics. I think we should land on, with the Haitian Revolution, like what you all would want people to do with the information once they educate themselves about the importance of the revolution, the importance of the Declaration of Independence that came out of it with the Haitians, and where we are now. What would you want people to do with the knowledge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess it's important for us to understand the system that we inhabit and that we, like, in many respects, like willfully or or willingly or unwillingly participate in. Which is a system of oppression. It's a system of profit and power. And what we're confronting today, is very much, and it just is what it is. It's a fascist movement in the Republican Party. That's just what it is. And one of the things that we can take away from the Haitian Revolution, who they're fighting back against a very oppressive regime in its own right, one that is again organized around property and power. Is finding a way to make that system of property and power unusable. And so one of the first things that the Haitian revolutionaries do is they target the cane fields, the sugar cane fields that had made Haiti a profitable colony. They target sugar mills and they target plantation houses because they want to make sure that their bodies can no longer be used, right, to make profit for their torturers. And this eventually is what wins the Haitian Revolution. I mean, there's battles, of course, all of that stuff. But this tactical approach to understanding how the system works and then making sure it doesn't work anymore, that's huge. And that's something that, is a big picture lesson we can, I think, apply to our own lives today. Understand how this system works that we're operating in, that we in some ways participate in, and then figuring out ways to make it not work. Not that so we can destroy everything, right? But so that we can make things better, so that we can create a livable future. And that's, I think, it should be our ultimate goal.
Sharif, I love how Dr. Horne said, we should just figure out how the system works and then figure out how to make it not work. That is the most gentle way of saying infiltrate and double cross.
Yeah. No, I mean, no doubt. I mean, I think that I agree with everything you said. Making sure that we're aware, making sure our kids and other people are having teach-ins. I think just the awareness of where we sit, um, and what our potential power is to change, right? And I think the other part of this, I think, is, and we've said it, but I want to call it out, is the struggle for independence is always linked with other people's struggle for independence, right? And so the more we understand how this is all connected, how we are positioned here in the States, but our efforts are linked with efforts in Africa and Asia and Central and South America and across these states, and it's all connected. And I think the more we're aware of that, the better. And we can see, this is what Malcolm talked about, right? Like, hey, this is a collective action against a global, and you said this, Chris, global white supremacist. It's not a state thing. It's not just this country. This is all connected. They all have the same blueprint. They all had a Berlin conference and many conferences very similar to the Berlin conference. So we need to make sure that we're having our conferences, but conferences of action, right? Unification and action. But you can't do that if you're ignorant. You can't do that if we're unaware. We can't do that if we think we're the only ones that are, experiencing this. The world is, the global majority is. We need more. What's the that white woman that was joined the Freedom Riders, Joanne Mulholland or something like that? Like, we need more of those people being educated as well. It's educating us as people of color, Black and brown people, indigenous people. It's also making sure that white people are educated about, what's happening, what has happened, and what will continue to happen unless they also stand up.
Mm-hmm. I actually love this show. I love this topic. I do think that education should be for action. I do believe that these platforms that we all have and these pieces of information, it's our job to share with each other. Because there's some histories and some education that you're not going to get from formal schooling sometimes. Hopefully, if you're an adult, you're a lifelong learner, and you take every opportunity to engage with people that have pieces of information that fill in your world fund of information. And that's what I think this is. That's why I was very happy to have Dr. Horne on today, and I'm glad you suggested it to us. I appreciate that. I think we need to start teaching our children, especially our children of color, that the struggle for liberation is a continuous act that doesn't stop with different points in history. It doesn't stop with a declaration or an uprising or a protest or getting on the news or, a viral video. None of those things. Or a grant, or getting a grant from but we need to also start empowering our young people with the idea that they were active actors and they had agency in the acquisition of their freedom. It wasn't, mean white people held us down, and then those mean white people decided to stop being mean. And once they decided to stop being mean, they freed us and let us go. And then everything was okay after that. We got our rights. That is the wrong story. It's, first of all, it's ahistorical and it's inaccurate. So it's the wrong story to implant in our young people. It's also disempowering that we teach them somehow we were released from our bondage, or, good people just changed their mind. Lincoln, the great Lincoln, just freed us one day and just decided, no. We have always called the question on our oppression and forced it to the point where we forced people to either get out of our countries, get out of our neighborhoods, release us from bondage. And now the extension of all of those movements has to be, you're going to have to pay for it, right? And the old movements were about, get out of my neighborhood, get out of my place, leave me alone. Now it is, no. Oh, by the way, you didn't pay your exit tax on the immoral movements that you did with our people. And that's where we need to be now. As an educated 21st century people, that would be the next demand, is that they actually pay, because nothing is more real and more material in global white supremacy than capital. And it is time. I'm here for the check. Stick them up. Not just kidding. Anyways, this has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you're freer than you were when we started. Our guest today was Dr. William Horne, PhD. He is a teacher, writer, speaker, activist, editor. You can find him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @WI Horne. Horne. So WIHORNE on Twitter. Please find him and follow him, because I can't do justice to the amount of good information that he produces on Twitter. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. We appreciate you.
Thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
So for our friends and our families who have been watching and been commenting on the show, please share it with other people. It's always hard on Fridays for people to join in the morning, but we know that you guys watch later. So please share it with your friends and family, and we'll see you next week for another